Hello and a warm welcome to the Philips African Dialogues. I'm Samantha Loring. Now, according to a recent study, since decolonization, approximately 40% of all African professionals have left the continent's shores, with Africa spending close to $4 billion. That's on technical assistance each year. That's across sectors such as health, education and public management. Another study revealed that by 2020, there could be a shortfall of 40 million high-skilled workers. That's versus 95 million low-skilled workers out in the international job market. Sub-Saharan Africa is particularly vulnerable, with youth unemployment rates averaging 12% across the region. Now, over the next 60 minutes, we'll be examining how to best address Africa's skills gap. And joining us in studio to share their views, JJ van Dongen, Senior Vice President and Market Leader for Philips Africa, Dani Steyn, Director for Skills for Africa, and Lone Sharp, Labour Economist at AdCorp, and then Brima Fal, Director for the Southern African region for the African Development Bank. And joining us from our bureau in Lagos to give us the Nigerian perspective on all of this, Professor Rukayatu Ahmed Rufai, Nigerian Minister of Education. And of course, you can also be part of tonight's discussion. You can share your thoughts on Twitter with the hashtag Philips Dialogues, and you can also follow us on @CNBC Africa. So send us any comments that you have on this key discussion when it comes to skills development across the continent. Let's get straight into it. And I'd like to almost put a diagnostic on the problem as it stands right now, because we talk about the post-colonization era and the brain drain, as we refer to it, on the continent. Brima, I'll start off with you. Give us your view right now on the skills deficit as it stands on the continent. Of course, there are specific areas where it's worse and specific areas where it's a lot better, but diagnose the problem for us.
Thank you very much, Samantha. I think in Africa, you're right, since colonization, we have tended to focus quite a bit on the sciences and the humanities in terms of the way that the curriculum is developed. Clearly, we have some of the best lawyers, economists, etc. But where we're lacking is having the skills that would match to the new economy, if you wish. And there what we are finding is that, especially among the youth, which is now about 2/3 of the African continent between the age of 15 to 25, you have a massive unemployment rate. If you stretch from North Africa, Tunisia, Egypt, etc., 25% unemployment rate, all the way to South Namibia, people are saying as high as 50%. Now, part of that in our assessment is due to the fact that there's a misalignment between what is being offered by the institutions and what the industries are demanding, and also what government is actually putting forward in terms of the curriculum in the educational sector. What is the impact of this? Well, for business, clearly, it's a loss of productivity and competitiveness. For government, you're probably looking at a time bomb, and I think we have seen that in North African countries as well, where the youth would probably, sort of
they're not prepared to sit around and wait.
So
yeah, that's what everyone has been talking about, the time bomb, the critical nature of addressing this with a matter of urgency from a government perspective. JJ, I'm going to jump straight to you, because give us your perspective from a business view right now in terms of broadly how a skills deficit in Africa impedes business growth like Philips across the continent.
We have a high growth strategy for Africa, and it impacts us in two ways. One is internally within our company, finding the right talent in the various areas, whether it's in South Africa or whether it's in any other country across Africa. And the second part is with our customers, because 70% of our business is with government and with business, and as such they are lacking skills or finding difficult in the areas of healthcare and in terms of engineering, lighting, things like that. And for them it's quite difficult, and for us it's difficult to interact together and provide the right solutions. So a lot of our focus is about supporting whether it's a Ministry of Health in terms of training healthcare professionals, or whether it's internally in our own organisation training our own staff. So those are the type of two areas we have to work in.
Yeah, and of course you've got a lot of initiatives, and before we get into that, we just kind of get a comment from everyone on the panel. Dani, you specifically specialise in the agricultural sector, you specialise here in South Africa. Is there a skills gap in South Africa, or how would you define the skills gap as it relates to agriculture?
People have land, they have the opportunity, but they do not know how to manage it. They sometimes know how to keep cattle, but they don't know how to manage it. They don't know how to decide, take decisions. And their biggest problem in the rural areas is to find markets. And they're inclined to focus on subsistence agriculture. You must always remember that the people we're working with, their priority is not skills, their priority is to eat. And if their priority is to eat, they want something that's immediately going to bring something in to eat.
So having that long-term strategic kind of business mind towards growing your farm isn't quite there.
Isn't there. At the moment, it's survival. And you must remember, anyone in a survival mood thinks very differently to what we think who are trying to train them. There's a process, there's a continuum. There's eat and sell, there's eat, sell and save. If you can get them to the point where they can sell, if they have a market, and if they can then from that, even if they save 50 rand, then we're beginning to progress. So the training must focus on something that's now going to give them something to eat. I have a problem with government has a system where they say to us, go and train them, and they get a qualification which is basically useful, but in their context, it's not going to give them something to eat. And then government pays them a stipend to come for training. So what they do, they come for training to get the stipend because they want something to eat. And
so it's incentivization
isn't working.
Program is not working.
Is not working because they'll come for 4 or 5 courses, which ultimately doesn't really improve them. Let me not generalize completely, because there are situations where it does work. But the quantity of money spent on that side is on that component is so big that I think we must think of a different incentive to get those people to move. I have an idea and a program that I think that could work.
Well, we'll definitely delve into that. And I know what you're speaking of right now is very much focused, I suppose, on the low-skilled aspect of the economy. And then, of course, you've done a lot of research into the highly skilled parts of the economy, and there certainly is a gap there when it comes to the need for skills. There's, certainly those jobs are being filled, and the unemployment rate in the highly skilled aspect of South Africa is actually marginal.
Yeah, if you look at the context of these things, in South Africa and the rest of Africa, labour markets have been heavily politicised since decolonisation. And that's meant certain things. It means things that might have been provided by the private sector are provided in Africa by the government sector, with certain efficiency consequences and others. Labour markets have been heavily bureaucratised throughout Africa. It's very difficult for labour markets to function freely. We find in our operations that extend throughout Africa at AdCorp all the way to the Middle East, we find that some of the basic business functioning is impeded for our work. For example, in our recruitment centres in Angola and Côte d'Ivoire and these places, it's very difficult for us to obtain work permits. It's very difficult for us to repatriate earnings. Some of the basic building blocks of the economy don't exist in many of these places. So I think there's still a long way to go for Africa to make labour markets in particular responsive to conditions on the ground. They remain very bureaucratized. There's lots of red tape. There are lots of opportunities for corruption, and those things are not being tackled, I think, with the priority they should be.
And of course, if you're talking about building blocks, the issue around education is really a starting point to look at. So I suppose let's just bring in the Labour Minister from Nigeria, Education Minister rather, from Nigeria, who is going to give us some perspective on the Nigerian experience right now when it comes to investment they're putting into the education space. Honourable Minister, thank you very much for joining us. You've been hearing comments we've been making about the deficit, the skills deficit in Africa, but from a Nigerian perspective right now, what is the focus from your ministry when it comes to getting the education system up and running and to a point at which it is providing the business sector, the private sector, with the skills necessary to grow the economy forward?
Yes, most importantly, the entire reform agenda of this administration of Mr. President, that is the transformation agenda, is basically focusing about the issue of human development, recognizing human development as the key in terms of developing the economy. So as such, the strategy plan that has been developed in the Federal Ministry of Education in order to address the skills gap is actually to work with the private sector to ensure that we produce graduates from our various institutions and even private institutions that are relevant to the society. Actually, over time, it was realized, like already mentioned, that even in Nigeria, we do have high level of unemployment. And of course, even those that are employed, there is this skill gap. So what we are doing at the moment in the Federal Ministry of Education in Nigeria in general is to ensure that we partner with the private sector. So we have just developed our National Vocational Qualifications Framework, which is the basis for ensuring that we have developed skills in our citizens who will now partner with the private sector and develop our industries. And actually, we are also working with the private sector in terms of forming a committee, which His Excellency Mr. President, Dr. Goodluck Ebele Jonathan GCFR, has just approved that by next week is going to be inaugurated to be basically driven by the private sector. What we are trying to do in Nigeria now is to ensure that what we study, or what our students study in our various institutions, and of course, in the institutions that we are also offering licenses as private, we develop skills who are going to be relevant in terms of developing our industries. We realize that we have skills gap. We have areas that do not have people with the skills to man those industries. And since the private sector are squarely responsible and need this manpower, so we now see the need that we have to partner with them. So as such, by the time we develop and we have developed our National Vocational Qualification Frameworks now, by the time it is approved by the Federal Executive Council and is put into use, Nigeria will now recognize the development of skills as the major focus of its human capital development, which will in turn develop the economy of the entire nation. So we are partnering with the private sector, and definitely they are going to drive the process of the entire PPP that we are working with in terms of skills development.
Of course, you know, we keep on hearing the private sector, the importance of the private sector, I suppose the communication coming from the private sector as to what skills they need and they're not getting. Do you think that this is over-reliance? Do you think that this is the right type of approach that government like Nigeria is having when it comes to addressing that skills mismatch?
We have realized that in most of our industries, we have this large skill gap. And the only way to go is to now partner with the private sector to ensure that, for one, whatever is coming out of the institutions is relevant, and number two, by coming up with this framework that we have just developed, which is in line with what Mauritius is also working with, in line with what South Africa is also working with, we'll definitely now see how to ensure that areas that we do lack skills are areas that we are going to develop. In other words, we also have what we call innovation enterprise institutions and vocational enterprise institutions, which are basically private sector driven. Over 145 of them have been licensed by Nigerian government in the last 2 years. And these are private individuals and corporate organizations that come on board. We do license them, and of course, they now produce people that are skilled in terms of the various areas of the economy, which we find to be very useful. So that Nigeria is, by day, becoming more and more inclined with working with the private sector, realizing that the private sector have the industries, and they require skilled manpower, which we know we are lacking, and which we are developing as at now.
It's the acknowledgement, as we were saying, JJ. And Professor, I'm just taking the conversation back to studio here. So JJ, your comments on the role of the private sector in helping to address that mismatch.
The key thing for us is that, and I'll just use two examples where we've been involved with. One is in Egypt with the Supreme Council of Universities, specifically Ain Shams and the American University in Cairo, where we interact with them in terms of training healthcare professionals, engineers. Now that has two benefits. One, it means that Ministry of Health in Egypt has skilled people, but it also means that when we recruit people to work for us who service equipment for that ministry, we have the right level of skills. So that's the type of involvement. We see the same thing here in South Africa with the University of Johannesburg, where we're interacting with them in terms of emergency care, training of emergency care professionals. And
how resource intensive is it? I mean, what's the cost to a company like yourself in terms of engaging with the public sector, engaging with public universities to be able to give them the understanding as to what you require?
I think, to be honest, in some ways, it's a bit of life and death. If we don't have trained people on the other side of to utilize our equipment effectively, then we're not doing the right job and the right have the right approach towards our partners, the ministries. So it's really important for us, and yes, there is a cost associated with that, but the issue is it does mean that we can actually have a high level of equipment. It means our equipment is utilized more efficiently. It means that we can actually see better patient outcomes.
Are you seeing that?
Yes, we do see that, yes.
Yeah, and so that model, are you taking it into other
countries? For example, if we work, I give an example in Zambia as well. We did a large-scale healthcare revitalization of Zambia a few years ago, and in that it required training of 300 professionals, that is radiographers and radiologists. Now, if we hadn't done that, there would not have been people to diagnose patient outcomes, there would not have been people to utilize our equipment, and so it is very important. So we see that as really quite fundamental if you want to be involved in the African economy, that you actually become a partner and you get more involved in terms of supporting the growth and the development of skills in those countries.
Ibrima, from your perspective, this is one of the key focuses when it comes to addressing the skills deficit from the African Development Bank's perspective. Getting that communication and that partnership going between the public sector, the private sector, and of course the universities included in that loop.
Absolutely, it's absolutely crucial.
How does that work? I mean, how are you initiating that?
Yeah, what we've been doing since the revolution in Tunisia is to help countries build the platforms. The platforms that will then allow the private sector, the unemployed, and the government to really have a sort of a platform to speak to each other. As a private sector person, I want to know when I need the skills, will I have it? And to ensure that, of course, it's a small investment, working with the government to say to the government, well, these are the laws that will probably inhibit me from being able to do this, to support you in terms of creating the skills that we need. So we find that quite useful. But what we also are doing with the universities, especially, it's like really turning around sort of an elephant. It's a very slow process. So what we try to do is to say you must talk to industry so that industry is represented in the curriculum rather than just keeping the curriculum to what we thought was the traditional education model.
You bring up the whole issue around that practical experience element and theoretical jargon that you often learn at universities, and you go into the real world and you realize that you have to almost kind of reskill yourself.
Exactly.
Lone, you've been hearing these views and they all sound great on paper. And what are your thoughts in terms of the private sector's practical experience when it comes to the type of graduates that are coming out of South African universities specifically?
I think there are different reasons why the private sector becomes involved in public projects. And we've got to distinguish between those where the projects are private initiative, privately funded, with outcomes of benefit to the private sector. And on the other hand, projects where the private sector is being brought in because of some kind of systemic failure in public service provision. When I hear the figures quoted about how Philips needs to support the training of engineers to support their medical equipment sales, that to me is a failure of public institutions to provide relevant and market-tested skills development. So I can give you an example from South Africa of how the private sector is taking extraordinary initiative in the development of skills. For a whole range of reasons, we've got a secondary and tertiary education system that is not functioning very well for lots of legacy issues. Yet at the same time, we've got nearly 1,830,000 vacancies for high-skilled people in South Africa. That skills shortage comes all the way from the primary, secondary, into the tertiary education system. So something that's emerged in South Africa over the last 5 or 6 years is what we call, quietly in the industry, edupreneurs. Entrepreneurs who are involved in the education sector, providing skills that for various reasons the secondary and tertiary public education systems are not providing. Just to give you a sense of the scale, those low-fee private schools, they're privately owned, privately operated, they're responsive to private sector skills shortage conditions. Enrollment in those low-fee private schools last year went up 25%, and enrollments in public schools declined 6%.
Yeah.
We're seeing much more responsiveness from a privately oriented education system at both secondary and tertiary level, and I think it's quite exciting. I think that kind of private initiative is something that could be utilized to great benefit throughout Africa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, just looking at, one of the examples, Curro Schools, which was listed in South Africa. It's a company that's recently become profitable. So that just shows where you can make money, or they're hoping to make even more money, but they have been able to break even from investing in education from a private sector perspective. Let's see if this example kind of translates into the Nigerian economy. Minister, if you could just give us an idea of your view right now on the role of the entrepreneur in the education system. Are you looking to create an environment where you can have edupreneurs, as we're talking about them here in studio, or entrepreneurs investing in private sector education in Nigeria?
Nigeria is also working hard on that. Actually, we have reviewed our entire curriculum of the basic and secondary education sector to work towards this. And at the level of tertiary and universities, we have already introduced the issue of entrepreneurship education that all our universities are also required to teach. And we developed our centers in these universities. So what we can say safely is that the issue of entrepreneurship education in Nigeria cuts across the entire curriculum of the education sector, realizing the fact that we need students that are coming out with skills already developed so that they don't even have to look for government jobs, which may not be there. They can now be employees of labor or even work in any industry with the skills that they have already acquired. So we are also having similar arrangement with the private sector. We have been licensing private universities and private polytechnics, for example. And as I have mentioned, we have already have this partnership with private sector in terms of innovation enterprise institutions and the vocational enterprise institutions. So what we can say is that we are trying to refocus the entire school curriculum and the minimum standards of our tertiary institutions. We have already refocused them into the issue of industry-based required skills that any student that we produce in the next few years, they will come out with skills that are relevant to the society, realizing the fact that we have been having this skills gap. So the entire education sector, as far as Nigeria is concerned now, is working towards skill development. And that is why I mentioned that we are working with the private sector.
Yeah.
So we are looking at the issue of
Minister, just coming back to, because you're talking about almost at the tertiary level, but you also have to look at it from the very basic level in terms of, primary education, starting at when people first enter the education system. I mean, just looking at the UNESCO report recently released, saying that Nigeria, in fact, has the largest out-of-school children in terms of the numbers that we're seeing that aren't in fact even brought into the education system, and talked about the prohibitive cost of education in Nigeria. So from a primary education perspective, what initiatives are you looking at right now to make sure that more children actually start being educated?
That issue also is a real challenge to the Nigerian education sector as at now, where Nigeria unfortunately is having the largest number of out-of-school children in the entire nation on earth, having 10.5 million out-of-school children, despite the programs that we have already put forward in place to ensure that we address this challenge, but we still are having this challenge of large number of out-of-school children, and of course even large number of illiterate youth and adults. So Nigeria is aware, and the way that we are facing the challenge of this out-of-school, we are faced with two different scenarios. We are faced with the issue of lack of access, and we are also at the same time faced with the issue of lack of quality in the system. And those are the two critical areas that the entire country is being faced in terms of ensuring that we improve access at the bottom and at the top, but at the same time, we ensure that we have quality in that system. So we have seen the UNESCO report, and already we are working on that, and definitely very soon you will hear what Nigeria is going to do on that.
Yeah, so an acknowledgement of that report there from the Minister. Lauren, I just want to come back to you because this is almost mirroring the situation we have here in South Africa. It's not unique to Nigeria, and it's certainly not unique to South Africa. How do we move forward from this? I mean, there have been some proposals on the table from the Education Minister here to incentivize teachers. Are we moving in the right direction?
Well, South Africa has a very unique set of circumstances. We have a very heavily politicized teacher workforce. 80% of teachers are unionized in South Africa. SADTU, the dominant teachers union, is very political and politically active. It's one of the government's alliance partners through COSATU. So we have a very different environment in South Africa. I think one of the things that our political leadership will have to tackle at some point in the education system is the fact that our education system has been captured by trade unions. I'll just give you a couple of examples.
Yeah, explain what you mean by that.
Just to give you a couple of examples, for many years, since 1996, the government has been trying to introduce performance agreements for teachers. That attempt has been a spectacular failure. The teachers' unions have resisted at every opportunity to introduce performance agreements. For example, one of the things that makes sense is to measure teachers on how well their learners perform. But this has been rejected in South Africa. Classroom inspectors, which are a standard feature of education quality control systems around the world, have now been abandoned. There are no classroom inspectors in South Africa. For all of these reasons, we're going to have some dramatic political leadership. Leadership meaning we will have to take unpopular decisions and take the workforce very resistant to these sorts of changes with us. Unfortunately, I mean, I hear what in Nigeria qualifies as a public-private partnership, and it sounds to me like it involves the issuing of licenses. When I talk about a public-private partnership, I'm thinking about something much more thorough, where the private sector provides the financing, the private sector operates and manages, perhaps even builds, operates and transfers to the government sector effective schools. None of those things are possible in South Africa. I'm delighted to hear they're occurring in Nigeria, if I've understood it correctly, but none of those things are happening in South Africa. So I'm very worried about the long-term potential for skills development because of these really fundamental issues we have in the education system.
Putting almost a stranglehold on making progress right now. But let's hit pause on the conversation. And we're going to be saying goodbye to Professor Raguyate Ahmed Rufai, who's the Nigerian Minister of Education. And she, of course, was joining us from our studios in Abuja. But we'll be back with more strategies to address Africa's skills gap when we return. Do stay tuned.